History. Some of you may think that history is boring or that it is just a subject in school that you don't care about, but history is more than likely the most important thing that a human being could ever make for the rest of time. When me and you die, how many people will really remember you? Or something you did other than just squirt out a child? You probably only get remembered in name or title only for, say, great-grandmother, great-grandfather. You don't really get remembered for anything that you do as a person unless you make something in history that is important enough for you to be remembered. For example, who do you think of when you think of people in history that probably will never be forgotten? George Washington? Well, assuming that America doesn't, we don't have like a nuclear apocalypse where America collapses, we probably remember George Washington the rest of the time. The first president of the United States. It's a pretty big deal. Obama. First black president of the United States. Probably remember him for the rest of the time. Isaac Newton. Incredible achievements in science that affect our understanding of the world as we know it. We probably will never forget Isaac Newton. He's simply someone too important. These people were, remembered for fantastic achievements in their own right. There's a lot of guys that were remembered for not so great things. For example, we will probably remember, so long as, no nuclear apocalypse, we will probably remember Adolf Hitler for the rest of time, whether you like it or not. Even little kids in elementary school today, nearly a full century later at this point of World War II, know who Adolf Hitler is. He's someone that we will remember. The Civil War was an incredibly important part of American history, but I bet most of you couldn't name a Civil War general outside of Robert E. Lee or Ulysses S. Grant. Gave you some time to think about that one. Maybe you can think of Custard or something like that. But my point stands that even these incredibly important people to American history, if you're American, if you weren't American, that question wasn't for you. But these are very, 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 very important characters to American history generally get forgotten just because, they just weren't the biggest names. If we forget people like Stonewall Jackson or Sherman, then what do we think that people in the future are going to remember about us? Probably nothing. And this comes to the crux of my point. Without history, we really don't know anything about anything. Think about, World War I, World War II, the 100 Years' War, the Gallic Wars with the Romans, the Persian invasion of Greece, to War on Terror, the Iraq War, the Gulf War. There are tons and tons of wars or just big historical events that nobody remembers anymore. We don't even know anything about them. And here's my point. If we don't remember history, then there is nothing about you or me or any of the people around the world anywhere that actually will just amount or matter to anyone. Here we are in the year of our Lord, 2024. Millions and millions of people have died, fought for, lived for different purposes throughout just the history of man. And those people may have lived and been able to find, purpose for themselves in their lifetime. But if people don't remember this type of stuff or history isn't taken of the things that they did, then the people, a few generations down the line don't even know that they fought for things. If we never, taught in school about the Civil War, or we never wrote down what happened in the Civil War, or we never made history about the Civil War, then who would even know that it happened? These are incredibly foundational points of our life. If we never made history about slavery, and we just never talked about it, 5 or 6 generations down the line, eventually people wouldn't even know that slavery happened. And that's a pretty big deal for America that slavery happened. But here's the point that I'm trying to make here. History matters to us because there are things in history that we can learn through the studying of it, or just knowing it. History is something that, to the everyday person, maybe we don't really recognize. We don't think about it too much. It's stuff that happened because we know it happened. We can use history, or the study of history, to understand different problems, conflicts, political situations, political discourse in our country, in our world, just by reading about other stuff that happened. I'm going to start throwing out different things that happened in history that we can easily apply to stuff that happens either nowadays or stuff that happened, a long time ago, but he could still figure it out just by reading about it. It is said that unless we study history, we are doomed to repeat it. I'm going to be using this section to prove that point by showing multiple different conflicts, events, moments in history that you can draw parallels between in both American history and world history. First, I'm going to be talking about the Vietnam War in comparison to the War on Terror or the American invasion of the Middle East following the September 11th attacks. There's actually a lot more in common between these two conflicts than just what happened during the wars, but I'm going to speed through it a little bit. Firstly, both the Vietnam War and the War on Terror lasted roughly 20 years. In both the Vietnam War and the War on Terror, America would send thousands of troops, weapons, bombs, planes, vehicles across to a country that most Americans probably couldn't even point to on a map. Even though the Vietnam War happened and the War on Terror happened, I bet most people still probably couldn't point at Vietnam on a map, or Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria. People really just don't know this stuff. In the Vietnam War, America invaded, and over the course of a just grueling, just horrible war for both sides, America eventually would end up losing to a much smaller, technologically unequal, deficient, economically unequal, deficient, and militarily unequal and deficient force, the Viet Cong, or the North Vietnamese Communist Forces. America would kill roughly 1.1 million people in the Vietnam War, 30 to 45% of which were civilians. Not great. America would go on to pull out of the war in devastating fashion during the fall of Saigon. Now, what's interesting about Vietnam and the War on Terror, or the war in Afghanistan, Iraq, is that both of these conflicts were started with insufficient reasoning from the U.S.'s side. One, to stop the spread of communism, which, what shit should I give if Vietnam on the other side of the world from us is communist? I don't think Vietnam is going to be doing anything to the entirety of America. And if you want to say, oh, domino theory, that's stupid too. Why do I care if Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia are communist? They don't do anything to us. And thus, when we invaded the Middle East, we did so in response to the September 11th attacks. Last I checked, the 4.5 million people that have died in result from the War on Terror, both directly and indirectly, were not Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda. We dropped more bombs in Vietnam than all countries of World War II combined. In the War on Terror, we would kill 4.5 million people doing basically the exact same thing. We were fighting a much lesser force technologically, militarily, and economically, but we still ended up losing. I would like to make a quick comparison between the leaders of the two forces. Uncle Ho! Ho Chi Minh and Osama bin Laden are two people who originally started actually basically on the side of America. I won't say on the side of, but roughly. Osama bin Laden was a member of the Mujahideen. The Mujahideen were a force fighting against the communist Russians in Afghanistan, who received funding from America and weapons from America. 20 years-ish later, they were using all the weapons and money that we gave them to shoot us. Osama bin Laden, despite originally helping the Mujahideen, will later come to hate American foreign policy and America, and then do
9/11.
9/11 wasn't very great. The Vietnamese were then colonized by the French. The French would hold on to Vietnam all the way up until the beginning of World War II, when in a classic loser French move, the French actually allowed the Japanese to come into Vietnam and occupy the country. Now you may be thinking, why would the French let the Axis powers into Vietnam to occupy them? Well, you might not be a history person, but here's a fun fact for you. Vecchi France actually was a Nazi puppet state in France for a very long period of time during the Second World War, and they allowed the Japanese to occupy Vietnam. All of our problems in history go back to the French. The Japanese occupy Vietnam. We don't like that because we don't like the Japanese. America sends funding as well as training to the Vietnamese during World War II so that they can successfully fight off the Japanese, which they do on September 2nd in 1945 when they declared their independence. Ho Chi Minh was actually pro-American for a very long time in his life before he became disillusioned with us as we allowed the French to come back after World War II and attempt to reoccupy Vietnam. We would fund both sides and provide training to both sides of the Vietnam War when it was just the French and the Vietnamese. And while Ho Chi Minh and the North Vietnamese appreciated our help, they eventually couldn't stand that we were helping the French any longer. Ho Chi Minh once actually said, and I quote, Americans are the last truly free people in the world. He sent this as a letter to Harry Truman when he was begging him to not let the French come back and recolonize Vietnam. In a typical loser, glowy move, the CIA hid these letters from Truman, and then we fought a war against them. That may be confusing how the American military could lose to these small, unregulated, not really military forces. In truth, we lost to guerrilla forces. They employed guerrilla warfare. Now, again, to emphasize the fact that everything in history repeats and that you can draw parallels between a lot of different things, I'm going to talk a little bit about guerrilla warfare in history. The Jews were the first to enact guerrilla warfare against the Romans in the Jewish-Roman War, the first one. The Jews would utilize things like their knowledge of the terrain, a cause that they believed in, and a lack of hard military structure to utilize better mobility and disrupt Roman patrols, supply lines, and things of the sort. They used the fact that they were a guerrilla force to their advantage to devastate the Roman army, which was occupying their territory. The Romans sent a psycho afterwards and defeated the Jews, but considering it was the first time that anybody ever did guerrilla warfare, it's pretty impressive. The Jews' reasoning for fighting against the Romans was because when the Romans showed up, they wanted the Jews to join their empire. The Jews didn't want to do that. Basically, the way Romans would let people join is they'd go, hey, you can join our empire so long as you worship our gods. All you have to do is add them to your pantheon, which a lot of people at the time did because they already had a pantheon of gods. The Jewish faith only believes in one God, so the Jews said no. The Romans didn't like that they said no, and then they fought wars about it. The Romans were so mad at the Jews that when they sacked Jerusalem, it is said that the value of gold in the territory decreased by half just because of the level of plunder that the Roman soldiers stole from the city. The tensions began rising for the rebellion because of religious tensions. Make sense? I just explained why. But the reason it actually broke out into straight-up rebellion was anti-taxation sentiment in the Jewish people. I don't know if you guys remember, but taxation is theft, no taxation without representation. America would later go to use the same reasoning for the American Revolution. And in the American Revolution, we utilized guerrilla warfare to defeat the British because the American colonist army would not have been able to stand and fight with the British in a field like they wanted. We fought unfairly using guerrilla tactics just like the Jews before us, except we won. Sorry, Jews, do better next time. Now, America would win its independence, both through outside help and guerrilla warfare implementation. You would think that we would know the effectiveness of guerrilla warfare. America in the 1900s had actually still not managed to run the Seminole tribes out of Florida. Seminole tribes were using guerrilla warfare to effectively defeat and defend their territories in Florida from the American army. America would spend $40 million at the time, which is $1.4 billion in today's money, attempting to remove the Seminoles from Florida. And it took over a decade of trying before they succeeded in 1942. America would use guerrilla warfare to win its independence. America would then fight for a decade against the Seminoles in Florida, who were using guerrilla warfare. America would then fight Vietnam, and we would lose to Vietnam because of the Vietnamese implementation of guerrilla warfare. We would then invade the Middle East during the War on Terror and lose in part because of the implementation of guerrilla warfare. If that isn't all connected and there isn't something to learn about there, then I don't know what you need to hear to make me prove this point. Vietnam were actually such monsters that after beating us, they invaded Cambodia. To displace Pol Pot, who had actually killed a third of his entire country. I mentioned earlier that America had helped both sides of the Vietnam War, being the French and the Vietnamese, of funding and training. I'm going to now compare that to something a little bit more modern. The Israeli-Hamas war taking place now has America both providing weapons, funding, training, and vehicles to Israel while trying to attempt to provide aid for the Palestine side of the conflict. Again, we were trying to play both sides of an incredibly complicated thing that we really shouldn't have any involvement in the first place. To speak a little bit more about the Jews, let's talk about the Romans again. The Gaelic people were Germanic tribes and just generally Central European guys that were around during Roman times who were considered barbarians by the Romans. The Romans were short little Italian guys, and they were afraid of the big shirtless guys that were living in the woods who would mess them up every once in a while. The Romans were so afraid that they were actually celebrated heavily by the Roman people if you just killed a lot of Gaelic people. They demonized the crap out of them. The Gaelic people were seen basically less than human. They were barbarians. when Julius Caesar, in I think maybe the first recorded instance of a genocide, killed a third of the entire population and enslaved another third, he was actually celebrated for it. Now, the Jews, as we all know, had the Holocaust. The Holocaust sucks. The Nazi Party effectively did basically the exact same thing that the Romans did way back when with the Gaelic people, when they demonized the Jewish population in Germany. People don't think about it, but it wasn't just the SS standing in the street beating up Jews. It was their neighbors, it was their friends, it was everybody. The Nazi Party had effectively done the same thing that the Romans did and made the Jews out to be demons. Now, since we're talking about Nazis, let's talk a little bit more about leaders. Not that I'm trying to compare Hitler to these guys, but Andrew Jackson, Ronald Reagan, and Donald Trump share a funny similarity. All three of them won in just an insane landslide victory in their respective presidential runs. All three of them were a little bit weird, just kind of crazy, charismatic guys that won just based off the fact that they were cooler than the other dudes. Trump wasn't even a politician. Reagan was an actor. Jackson was a senator, but, whatever. It shows that people follow a charismatic leader. We see something interesting or something outside of the norm of these people that we saw with Reagan and Jackson, and that's why they made it, even when it seemed like there was no shot for them to win. William Sherman changed warfare basically for the rest of time in the American Civil War, which is seen as the first modern war, when he implemented his tactic of hard war upon the South. Hard war was basically going to town, doing things like destroying infrastructure, just letting it rip on people and just dedicating yourself completely to destroying the enemy. This would affect warfare for the rest of time because of the implementation of total war. Here's a clip of Hitler saying, "Do you want total war?" Pretty self-explanatory. Total war means things like car company makes tanks now. Woodwork companies will make rifle stocks now. It means dedicating yourself completely to a war, and Sherman really showed how it was done way back when in the American Civil War. This may seem a little bit out of left field, but I'm just, bringing up more stuff that connects. Veterans Day happens on November 11th because of the armistice signing in World War I. World War I veterans came back, and they were mistreated. They felt that they didn't get what they deserved for fighting for their country. They actually went as far as to storm the Capitol. They had a riot in the Capitol because of their mistreatment. January 6th, things repeat themselves. But this actually alludes further to how veterans would be treated in the future. The Vietnam War, everybody knows, Vietnam veterans came back, were mistreated horribly, spat on, called baby killers, all that stuff. And they never really got their thanks for the service until recent years. Now you'd think we learned after the first two. But in the War on Terror, when veterans came back in the past 20 years, they came back to the VA mistreating them, they came back to not having enough money, they came back to homelessness. It's the same type of stuff that's been happening for the past 100 years at this point. Things repeat whether we think that we fixed them or not. I'm going to tie this into some veterans again real quick. Things are going to get a little bit dicey, a little bit dark and sad here, and this is going to be the last thing of this video for me. Here's a video of Wehrmacht soldiers from World War II, German soldiers, defending their actions in a village of mostly civilians. A woman in the video approaches these soldiers and accosts them for the fact that her village lost a very large amount of people because of the German invaders just killing them. The German soldiers in response say, "Well, there's always a reason." She says, "No reason is good enough for that." German soldiers say, "We would never do that unless there was a reason for it. Did something happen in the village?" The woman goes on to say that partisans, rebels fighting an occupying force, attacked Germans outside of the village. The Germans came back and enacted vengeance upon the village, killing many people. The Germans' defense was, "It is the partisans' fault. They are hiding amongst you." To relate this to something happening right now, Israel is having their war in Gaza against Hamas. Israel is bombing hospitals, they are blowing up aid vehicles, they are killing undoubtedly a very large amount of civilians and committing a near, maybe even not near, but straight up genocide against the Palestinians in Gaza. They are doing so under the defense of Hamas is hiding amongst you, it is their fault. I don't think I gotta paint it any clearer than that. This isn't meant to be bashing of anything, and this isn't meant to be a political standpoint, but I'll end this on a quote from my favorite philosopher, Conan O'Brien. "In the end, every grave goes unvisited." Goodbye. Thanks for watching.